The Hebrews in Egypt had expected to obtain their freedom without any special trial of their faith or any real suffering or hardship. But they were not yet prepared for deliverance. They had little faith in God, and they were unwilling patiently to endure their afflictions until he should see fit to work for them. Many were content to remain in bondage rather than to meet the difficulties attending removal to a strange land. And the habits of some had become so much like those of the Egyptians that they preferred to dwell in Egypt. Therefore the Lord did not deliver them by the first manifestation of his power before Pharaoh. He overruled events more fully to develop the tyrannical spirit of the Egyptian king and also to reveal himself to his people. Before the infliction of each plague, Moses was to describe its nature and effects so that the king might save himself from it if he chose. Every punishment rejected would be followed by one more severe, until his proud heart would be humbled and he would acknowledge the maker of heaven and earth as the true and the living God. And before we move on with more of this interesting ancient information, we pause for an affirmation in the things of faith. This time, God is love. Seldom found in the Bible as an individual specific statement, but often stated as part of a situation. 1 John chapter 4, verse 8, King James Version, God is love. We read from our writings, Christ loves the human race, and in every action of his life, he has expressed this love. John 14:15, a verse that you know so well, if you love me, keep my commandments. Back to the writings, his saving power and his love are ever to be the theme of those who believe in God. And back to the writings, 1 John, Scripture, chapter 4, verse 16. It's stated again as part of a verse, but we isolate three words, God is love. And so we continue on with the information regarding the plagues, the 10 plagues of Egypt, and then we come to the 10th plague. The judgment of which Egypt had first been warned was to be the last visited. God is long-suffering and plenteous in mercy. He has a tender care for the beings formed in his own image. If the loss of their harvests and their flocks and their herds had brought Egypt to repentance, the children would not have been smitten. But the nation had stubbornly resisted the divine command, and now the final blow was about to fall. Before the execution of this sentence, the Lord through Moses gave direction to the children of Israel concerning their departure from Egypt, and especially for their preservation from this coming dreadful judgment. Each family was to slay a lamb and sprinkle its blood on the doorposts, so that the destroying angel might not enter that dwelling. I read on. The Israelites obeyed the directions that God had given them. In awe, the people prayed and watched. The heart of the eldest born, from the strong man down to the little child, throbbing with indefinable dread. Fathers and mothers clasped in their arms their loved firstborn, as they thought of the fearful stroke that was to fall upon that nation that night. But no dwelling of Israel was visited by the death-dealing angel. And so in summary, 3 items of presentation thus far. The 10 plagues of Egypt, all 10 of them. Affirmation of faith, God is love. And then specifically an application regarding the 10th plague. Our topic for the day, as it is in the bulletin, as was stated, the 10 plagues of Egypt. Let's turn in the Bible now, the sacred writings, to the book of Exodus. Remarkable information, historically accurate, significant for us in our world of today. We're looking now at Exodus chapter 7, and we are reading verse 20. This is what the information says in the writings. And the Lord said to Moses, "Rise up early in the morning." Now this was down there in the land of Goshen. I took the opportunity on my most recent visit to Egypt to go down to the land of Goshen specifically to see what it looks like. And we are aware that the land of Goshen was a very productive area. When the land is dry, the soil looks grey. When the soil is wet, it is jet black. Very productive, alluvial soil. Very flat area, and they had irrigation canals on a square pattern. The mighty Nile River, very wide, half a mile wide in some places, flowing down from the upper mountains down through Egypt into the Mediterranean. But the people of Egypt had formed this irrigation system of square canals, or should I say the square pattern of canals, and the water was available right throughout the land of Goshen. And so when Princess Hatshepsut went down in the early morning to the Nile River, she actually went down to an irrigation canal running off the Nile River. And there she found, of course, the little floating basket which contained the baby Moses. That was not the only occasion in ancient Egypt when mothers placed their babies into a waterproof basket that way. It happened on many occasions. Some were rescued, some were not. And in the case of Moses, we know the story, the way that it worked out. And now the time has come. Moses is 40 years old, 80 years old. He spent 40 years in Egypt, 40 years in the Middle East away from that area. He has come back again to lead the children of Israel out of their bondage into the promised land. And so the Lord said to Moses, "Rise up early in the morning, stand before Pharaoh. And as you walk now amongst the ruins of that old city, you can see some of the grandeur of what ancient Egypt looked like in this particular area. This is the location where Joseph was sold as a slave. It's where Moses was born and grew up. And they had lordly palaces there in this area. So when the Pharaoh comes out in the morning, around about daylight, for the morning ablutions, we would say, stand before him and tell him, let my people go, that they may serve me. Verse 21, if you don't do that, if you will not let my people go, behold, I will send swarms of flies upon you and upon your servants, upon your people, into your houses. The houses of the Egyptians will be full of these flies, and also the ground whereon they are. And these things are written this way in the information that is given in all of these things. Now, that is a very, very important passage of Scripture in this information. That is chapter 8 and verse 20 that is given there. Now, if you go back to chapter 7 and look at verse 20, you see the beginning of these things. This is an intense period in which the children of Israel are involved. Moses is involved, and you can see the intensity of these things by the verse that we read just a few moments ago. Now, chapter 7, verse 20 refers to these things in this particular way. This is now the first plague. Moses and Aaron did as the Lord commanded. He lifted up the rod, not the magician's rod, but the rod of Moses, the rod of Aaron, smote the waters that were in the river, in the irrigation canal, in the sight of Pharaoh, in the sight of his servants, and all the waters that were therein turned to blood. A disastrous situation that is evident in this particular circumstance. I read Patriarchs and Prophets 2:65. The sacred stream ran blood. The fish died, and the river became offensive to the smell. The water in the houses was likewise changed to blood. Jewish history, Josephus, page 61, says the same thing. The Egyptian river ran with bloody water. And that is not English profanity, that is a statement. The Egyptian river ran with bloody water, and they had no other spring of water. It brought upon those that ventured to drink of it great pains. It was sweet and fit for drinking for the Hebrews. God's blessing upon his people was early, even at that stage, evident. That's plague number 1. Now we look at chapter 8, verse 6, and we're looking at the information that is contained in this chapter 8, verse 6, and you have now the second plague. And Aaron stretched out his hand over the waters of Egypt, and the frogs came up and covered the land. The frogs came up, covered the land, and I read here in Patriarchs and Prophets, page 265, the information that is given in the writings, and this is what it says. They overran the houses. They took possession of the bedrooms, and even the ovens and the kneading troughs. The slimy pests had now become intolerable. Josephus 61, the country was full of filthy slime. As they were born and as they died, a stink arose from them. That's sort of literal terminology, isn't it? We come to the third one, the third plague now, and that is found in the same chapter, book of Exodus, chapter 8, and looking at verse 17. So they did say, verse 16, the Lord was talking to Moses and to Aaron. He told them what to do, and they did what they were told. For Aaron stretched out his hand with his rod, smote the dust of the earth, and it became lice in man and in beast. All the dust of the land became lice throughout all the land of Egypt. What do I read? Patriarchs and Prophets. I note that your Sabbath school teacher read from Spirit of Prophecy information that was significant, same book. This is now page 266. At the command of God, Aaron stretched out his hand, and the dust of the earth became lice throughout all the land of Egypt. Pharaoh called upon the magicians to do the same, but they could not. The work of God was thus shown to be superior to that of Satan. The magicians themselves acknowledged, this is the finger of God. But the king was still unmoved. Why did Pharaoh Senkerist not acquiesce in these matters? He was simply a new Pharaoh, had been on the throne only a few months, replaced a man who had died of old age, his father, and he was a young upstart, going to control things. The land will do what I say and what I want. He was not going to follow the demands that the God of the universe had placed upon him. Jewish history says the same thing. There arose an innumerable quantity of lice, and they were not able to destroy this sort of vermin, neither with washes nor with ointments. Now, that's the first 3 plagues of ancient Egypt. This is where the significance becomes apparent to us as a last day parallel in these things. You're looking at chapter 8 in the book of Exodus. Now note what inspiration tells us in verses 22 and 23. Exodus 8, 22 and 23. Let me see if I have the right information. Yes, I need to find the right page. Here we are. Exodus 8, 22 and 23. God says, verse 20, the Lord said to Moses, rise up early. This is important. Verse 22, I will sever in that day the land of Goshen, in which my people dwell, that no swarms of flies shall be there to the end, that thou may knowest that I am the Lord in the midst of the earth. I will put a division between my people and your people. Tomorrow this sign shall be. And the Lord did so. Now, you'll notice God says he will put a division between his people and the Egyptians. 3 plagues fell on the Egyptians and the Jews, but still a little bit of protection for God's people. After the 3rd plague, there is a division. No more of the plagues of Egypt will fall upon God's people, only upon the Egyptians. Why couldn't the Egyptians open their eyes and see what was happening? Plague 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 on them and not upon the Hebrew people. Land of Goshen, that's where they lived, very productive area. They had light, they had food, they had protection. The Egyptians had nothing. Like we said in Sabbath school a little while ago, when the Garden of Eden was removed by divinity from planet Earth in advance of the events of the flood of Noah's day, why did not the people in that ancient era observe what was going on? When they saw the birds and the animals coming into the ark in order, as though they were controlled, why did they not observe these things? Sin has its way in human conduct. Righteousness and faith do not always match in these circumstances. So we see here that God had put a difference between his people and the Egyptians. Patriarchs and Prophets 2:66. As had been foretold, this next visitation did not extend to the land of Goshen. They were free from these things. Now they had to go through problems, but God protected and cared for his people. Now, why did God's people suffer, therefore, under the first 3 plagues? Why didn't God separate his people immediately and care for them specifically and allow the plagues only upon the Egyptians? Well, there is an answer to this information, even though God did protect his people to a certain degree. Story of Redemption 112. Back when we were volunteer pastoring after official retirement, we provided a copy of the Story of Redemption to every member of the congregation. This is a very easily written, easily read, easily understood volume. Every Adventist ought to read that through at least once. Page 112. Many of the Hebrews were content to remain in bondage rather than to go to a new country and meet with the difficulties attending such a journey. Let's remember, that's where they were born. That was their homeland. The Hebrew people at that stage were born in Egypt. You remember where you grew up. You have a love and nostalgia for that area. We all do. And the Hebrews had nostalgic memories of some of these things, even though they were in slavery. Being surrounded with idolatry, many of them had lost the knowledge of the true God and had forgotten his law. They united with the Egyptians in their worship of the sun, moon, stars, animals, images, the work of men's hands. Why did God permit the first 3 plagues to affect the Hebrews? To get their attention. Do God's people suffer in our world of today? Do Adventist people suffer? Yes, we do. I can remember there was a volcano that exploded in the Philippine Islands, Mount Cinnabon. Volcanic ash, this is a few years ago, rose more than 3 miles high. 25,000 people were evacuated, including several thousand Adventists. 37 Adventist churches in the area and 34 were damaged or destroyed. Only 3 remained undamaged. What happened? The Adventist people mitigated with the circumstances of the local people, and there was a witness that became evident that way. What about in the Philippines? That was in one location. What about in the Philippines? Typhoon Haiyan, that was known under that name internationally. They call it Yolanda within their country. This typhoon covered an area the size of the United States. Wind gusts reached 235 miles an hour. and the barometer went to an intense low, an unbelievable low of 25.34. All three of these parameters qualify for the Guinness Book of World Records. But what happened? On Panay Island, ADRA worked there, and they found 121 Adventist churches destroyed. Why couldn't God save his people? Why couldn't God save his churches? God has to get the interest of his people also in all things. And sometimes I tell our people when I'm visiting with them, serve God in the days of your prosperity. Don't wait until God has to send you adversity to gain your attention. Love him, honor him, serve him in these things. All right, now, we have noted something that is highly significant. And to indicate these things, let me move over here. There were 10 plagues of ancient Egypt. The first 3 fell upon the Egyptians and the Hebrews. Then God placed a corridor, a difference between his people and the Egyptians. Does that mean you're all God's people and you are Egyptians? Not quite. But there is a difference in the biblical information between the Egyptians and God's people. Then the 7 last plagues of ancient Egypt fell only upon the Egyptians. The first 3 plagues, the 7 last plagues. When we come to the Bible information later on regarding the last days, you'll see an interesting significance that is parallel with this information. We move on now to the remaining 7 of these plagues, and we observe what took place. Exodus 8:24. Well, we've sort of read that before, where the Lord sent these flies. Flies filled the houses and swarmed upon the ground. These flies were large and venomous, and their bite was extremely painful to man and beast. On one occasion, I was playing tennis after work at the little tennis ground that we had at the division compound in Pune, India. And there was a mild plague of huge flies. They were large flies at this particular time. While we were playing tennis, they would attempt to attack and sting. And I had one of these flies land on me. I tried to kill it. It fell off. Didn't die. I got another one of these flies, put it on the ground, and I rolled my shoe over this fly. And when I had rolled my shoe over the fly in an attempt to kill it, it just simply wriggled its body and fluttered its wings and flew off. Those bites by those flies were painful. This is what happened in ancient Egypt. God separated his people from the Egyptians and allowed no flies to appear throughout their coast. Jewish history says God filled that country full of various sorts of pestilential creatures, such as had never come into the sight of men before. That's plague number 4. Let's now look at number 5, which is found in Exodus chapter 9 and looking at verse 3. And the Lord did that thing on the morrow, and all the cattle of Egypt died, but of the cattle of the children of Israel none died whatsoever. Verse 5, at the appointed time, the Lord will do this thing, and it happened that particular way. So it is suggested that this murrain was some form of anthrax, an acute disease that affects animals and humans, makes massive swelling, blood oozing from the wound. And you might remember that there were some nasty people in this country a few years ago who were sending anthrax powder, white anthrax powder in envelopes to people they didn't like. Sometimes it was pretend and sometimes it was real. A more terrible stroke followed, murrain upon all the Egyptian cattle that were in the field. Both the sacred animals and the beasts of burden were destroyed. It had been distinctly stated that the Hebrews were to be exempt. And Pharaoh, Sennacherib, on sending messengers to the home of the Israelites, proved the truth of this declaration. And that young upstart of a king still was obstinate. Josephus, the outdoor animals were killed with this distemper, which the the human beings underwent also. Plague number 6, and this is Exodus chapter 9, and let me see, we're looking now over the page, verse 6. Exodus chapter 9 and verse 6, verse 8 refers to these things, and verse 10 specifically. They took ashes of the furnace and stood before Pharaoh, and Moses in Pharaoh's sight sprinkled it up towards the heaven, and it became a boil breaking forth with flames upon man and upon animal. Number 6, Moses was next directed to take ashes of the furnace, and as the ashes were sprinkled towards heaven, the fine particles spread over all the land of Egypt, mind you. Now, Egypt is quite a large country, even though it looks small on the map. And I have driven pretty well from one extreme to the other, and it's more than a day's journey by car from one place, from one extent up to the Mediterranean area. And so the whole nation of Egypt was covered with these ashes and this fine dust this way. Something miraculous taking place. Moses was next directed to take ashes of the furnace, and as the ashes were sprinkled towards heaven, the fine particles spread over all the land of Egypt, and wherever they settled, they produced boils upon man and beast. Jewish history, their bodies had terrible boils, and a great part of the Egyptians perished in this manner. Number 7, it's getting dramatic. Chapter 9, verse 23. And let me see if I can get the right verse here. Yes. Moses stretched forth his rod, not the magician's rod. Moses stretched forth his rod towards heaven, and the Lord sent thunder and hail. And the fire ran along upon the ground, lightning ran along the ground, and the Lord rained hail upon the land of Egypt. It never happens that way. This was a new weather pattern. A plague of hail was next threatened upon Pharaoh. Rain or hail was unusual in Egypt, and such a storm as was foretold had never been witnessed before. The storm came as predicted, thunder and hail and lightning mingled with it. Ruin and desolation everywhere marked the path of the destroying angel. The forests were broken down, the crops were destroyed. They were fast losing all that had been gained by the labors of the Hebrews. The whole land was threatened with starvation. The land of Goshen alone was spared. Jewish history, Josephus 61. Hail was sent down from heaven, and such hail it was as Egypt had never seen before. This hail broke down the boughs of their trees laden with fruit. Number 8, chapter 10, verse 13. Number 8, 10, 13. Moses stretched forth his rod again over the land of Egypt. The Lord brought an east wind upon the land all that day. So this was a natural circumstance that was under the control of divinity. Moses stretched forth his land. The Lord brought an east wind upon the land all that day, all that night, and when it was morning, the east wind brought the locusts. Apparently they had hatched over there in Arabia, Saudi Arabia, and so the wind brought them in. Moses now stretched forth his rod over the land, and an east wind blew and brought locusts. They filled the sky until the land was darkened, and they devoured every green thing remaining. A strong west wind carried the locusts away towards the Red Sea. Jewish history, a tribe of locusts consumed the seed, which was not hurt by the hail, so that to the Egyptian all hopes of future fruits of the ground were entirely lost. It's getting dramatic. Chapter 10, verse 22. Moses stretched forth his hand again towards heaven, and there was a thick darkness in the land of Egypt 3 days. They could not see one another. They rose up from one place to another for 3 days, but all the children of Israel had light in their dwellings. I read again, Patriarchs and Prophets. Suddenly a darkness settled upon the land, thick and black. Not only were the people deprived of light, but the atmosphere was very oppressive, so that it was difficult to breathe. The sun and moon were objects of worship to the Egyptians. In this mysterious darkness, the people and their gods alike were smitten. Story of redemption. The Hebrews had a pure atmosphere and light in their dwellings. Jewish history, a thick darkness without the least light spread itself over the Egyptians, whereby their sight being obstructed and their breathing hindered by the thickness of the air, they died miserably and under a terror lest they should be swallowed up by the dark cloud. Notice the intensity and the magnitude of what is taking place under the 7 last plagues of Egypt. Now we come to the final dramatic event, the death of the firstborn children. Exodus 11, turn the page, verses 1 and 5. And the Lord said to Moses, "Yet will I bring 1 plague more upon Pharaoh and upon Egypt. Afterwards he will let you go. When he will let you go, you must go out." Verse 5, "And all the firstborn in the land of Egypt will die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh that sits upon his throne, even unto the firstborn of the maidservant that is behind the mill, and even the firstborn of the animals. There will be a great cry throughout all the land of Egypt." Many of the Egyptians had been led to acknowledge the God of the Hebrews as the only true God. These now begged to be permitted to find shelter in the homes of Israel when the destroying angel should pass through the land. They were gladly welcomed. Can you imagine our world of today with the Arabs seeking accommodation with the Jews? That wouldn't work very well, would it? Similar circumstance anciently. But the people of the Lord, the Hebrews, they accepted the Egyptian foreigners. They were gladly welcomed, and they pledged themselves henceforth to serve the God of Jacob and to go forth from Egypt with his people. Throughout the vast land of Egypt, the pride of every household had been laid low. The shrieks and the wails of the mourners filled the air. King and courtiers, with blanched faces and trembling limbs, stood aghast at this overmastering horror. The death of every firstborn child that was not protected. God's people were. God sent the plague upon the Egyptians, Jewish history says, for the destruction of the firstborn came upon the Egyptians that night. For God's people, then came the Exodus. Now, you will notice the magnitude and the intensity of these events there in ancient Egypt. 3 first plagues upon the community, Egyptian and Hebrew. A division between the Egyptian and the Hebrews, the 7 last plagues of Egypt being poured out only upon the Egyptians. There is a parallel between this significant time procedure and the events of the last days. How long did the plagues of Egypt take place? We're told that the first plague lasted 7 days. It's written in the Bible. We are told that the 9th plague lasted 3 days. We are aware that the first plague began at the overflowing of the Nile in the year 1446 BC in the month of June. We know that the Passover ended the plagues of Egypt. That was in April 1 year later, 1445 BC. A total of approximately 3/4 of a year. Maybe there is a parallel between the plagues of Egypt and the 10 plagues of the last days, the 3 first plagues of the last days, and the 7 last plagues of the last days. Maybe they will last approximately the same time period. I read regarding this parallel. Great controversy, and God's people should be reading that book and those last paragraphs, last chapters. Great controversy 6:27. The plagues upon Egypt, when God was about to deliver Israel, were similar in character to those more terrible and more extensive judgments which are to fall upon the world just before the final deliverance of God's people. Did you get the magnitude and the intensity of that? You saw what happened in ancient Egypt, the destruction that came to their land. Their nation was devastated, destroyed, their economy was hopeless, large majority of the population was dead in less than a year. We know from our writings that there will be trouble in this country as well as the rest of the world. And we know that in the last events, certain circumstances will take place in this country that will boggle the imagination of the wicked and the righteous alike. I read this again. The plagues upon Egypt when God was about to deliver Israel were similar in character to those more terrible and extensive judgments which are to fall upon the world just before the final deliverance of God's people. The Hebrews were protected after the third plague. No flies, no murrain, no boils, no massive storm, no locusts, no darkness, no death of the firstborn. Psalm 91, verse 10 says, the plague will not come nigh thee. God will protect his people in all of these circumstances. And so that's as far as we can go in the information today. We interrupt the flow of progress, and on the next occasion we will present the story of the 10 plagues of the last days, the 3 first plagues and the 7 last plagues of the last days, and you will see how these things fit into this circumstance. But our time has ended, and it's time for the last hymn to be placed upon the screen in the nice way that is done in your congregation. 250